Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I'd like to begin by bragging about my state of Florida. I'm so proud that in response to some of the student government associations endorsing the BDS movement, the state of Florida passed legislation that divests our state of any entities that are participating in the BDS movement. That legislation built on the landmark work of my colleague, Mr. Deutsch, during his service in our state legislature when he ensured that our state divested from companies that were engaging with Iran and their nuclear program. Rabbi Cooper, I want to drill down specifically with you, since you mentioned student government associations. Are there any commonalities, methods, tactics, practices that groups are using to influence student government associations to pass BDS resolutions? And to what extent would those methods or tactics be impacted by the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act?
Well, I'm not an expert on the student associations, but when you read about what's going on, by the way, not only in the United States, but also what's going on in Canada, in which you have activists who are exercising the First Amendment rights, let's say, who are anti-Israel, have a pro-Palestinian agenda. They get involved with student government, they stay involved, and in many times they have leadership roles. Where this act would help is when Jewish students are called out at meetings of the government, of the student government, including at UCLA, not small colleges, up in Canada as well. When Jewish students are called out and they're basically told you don't belong in student government because, in effect, it's dual loyalty. You don't really have a loyalty to the United States. Your loyalty is to a foreign entity, Israel, and therefore you should be booted off the board. And there are other, obviously, kinds of actions that can be taken in terms of funding. Certain kinds of speakers will get it. Certain activities will get it. But I would say, overall, that if it was just a matter of student activism, then the most important message we can send through Hillel and AEPI and all the other groups is make sure Jewish kids stay involved in student government. But when you have, as we have now had numerous examples, where Jewish kids are called out and say you don't belong here because you're a Jew, that's exactly why we would, that student would be able to go to an administrator and, if necessary, to the Department of Education to get redress.
Mr. Greenblatt, from the Anti-Defamation League standpoint, how do you parse that distinction between legitimate advocacy that we can combat with other legitimate advocacy and speech that would run afoul of this act?
Thank you. I think it's really important to keep in mind that all this legislation does is require, in the plain language of the definition, be consulted by administrators when a case is brought. This doesn't mandate that they do anything. This doesn't handcuff them. This doesn't limit free speech. It simply says when an issue is brought to their attention that they consult the definition. Now, again, I think as stated by another one of the witnesses, they would need to determine that there is indeed harassment taking place. But having a definition that codifies what is indeed a very complex problem wouldn't in any way, shape, or form prohibit or, again, handcuff an administrator to prevent free speech.
I found the data that you've provided in your written testimony regarding the frequency of anti-Semitic events rising, particularly troubling on college campuses. To what extent do we tie that solely to the activity on a college campus versus perhaps some nefarious forces influencing students as early as high school? Because I'm starting to see more and more folks advocating for BDS-type advocacy, which in my mind is modern-day anti-Semitism at the high school level. Are you able to draw a nexus there?
So, Mr. Congressman, I think that's a very good and I think it's an important question. So there are two parts to it. To the first part, if we try to understand what's the causality in the increase in anti-Semitism, I think extremists from both sides feel emboldened for different reasons vis-a-vis the political climate. And so that's creating the conditions in which we're seeing an uptick in activity. And that isn't something that's a function of some academic treatise. That's the reality and what we're seeing all around the country. But to your point, yes, I would agree that anti-bias, anti-hate content in schools, particularly at the high school level, can be an antidote to intolerance, and that is another area that I think we should explore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.